Hello, good morning. Can you hear me well? Yes? Okay, great. So thanks a lot for the invitation, and sorry for not being able to be with you today. I hope it will work well technically for this presentation. My name is Xavier Sol. I'm working for non-governmental organization NGO called Counterbalance. We are a coalition of different groups working on public finance and investments from the European Union especially. In recent years, with some of our colleagues around Europe, we tried to explore the new wave of large-scale infrastructure projects that are being financed all over the world, trying to understand what are the key drivers behind what we call the global infrastructure agenda currently under construction. And why it's relevant for this discussion of today is because actually the Belt and Road Initiative is not an isolated initiative. It's actually the most advanced experiment around mega corridors, but you find examples of mega corridors on many regions and continents around the world. The starting point with our presentation is that basically functioning infrastructure is a prerequisite for our daily lives in the current economic system. Our use of all different kinds of infrastructure involves its degradation, and because technology and science advance, results in the need to continuously fix, replace, upgrade, and develop new infrastructure. That's one side. Then on the other side, you have, let's say, the new champions of infrastructure, which rely on the role of infrastructure investments as a means to restore economic growth, demands, and jobs in the global economy. So following the economic crisis, infrastructure is more and more being portrayed as the silver bullet, a magic bullet to restore growth and jobs. What is this new global infrastructure agenda that we see emerging? I mean, basically, since the financial crisis, a consensus has emerged on this global infrastructure agenda, which is largely based on the assumption that there is a huge infrastructure gap to be filled. For example, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, estimates that there needs to be an additional $70 trillion in infrastructure taking place by 2030. So that's the basis. There is this infrastructure gap, and then how to fill it. And here many governments have been facing a dilemma. How to finance such infrastructure and boost economic recovery with public resources, while at the same time, there is often a harsh austerity logic and neoliberal dogma prevailing at national level. How to find a way between the two? That's one question. But then on the other hand, you have global capital markets, which helped the accumulation of private wealth by a few, which now have been chasing investment opportunities in new profitable assets. And that's the connection of these two dynamics that is taking place right now. That's when magic, let's say, is supposed to happen. So in the hopes of many governments, infrastructure is to become a new asset class, attracting all this private liquidity floating around, and then lessening, reducing the financial burden for the public financiers, and especially for the public coffers in many countries. And to do so, there are many public banks and financial institutions that are being called at the rescue to put in place the prerequisites for this global infrastructure agenda to materialize. And here, I try to list some of the key features of this agenda. The first one is that infrastructure projects have to be mega-sized to attract large amounts of capital on a long time period. Then, infrastructure needs to become and to be turned into an asset class, so that investors can look at infrastructure as pure revenue streams, not as physical infrastructure like hospitals, schools, bridges, or power plants. They want it to be an asset class, financial asset, with ultimately the idea that these financial assets will actually generate profits when being traded on financial markets, and that the profit will be higher than just with, let's say, the user fees or the physical outputs from the physical infrastructure. The third point is that a new financial environment has to be built in order to manage and trade the new financial assets. For instance, by dismantling restrictions on investments for pension funds and insurances, increasing derivative-based financial products, and developing debt markets. So this is around the financial engineering around infrastructure. And the last point is that actually a new wave of public-private partnerships, so these so-called PPPs, and privatization needs to put on the market even more what used to be state-owned assets, including infrastructure in the health and education sector. In our view, this global agenda has huge financial implications. Actually, this topic of infrastructure and infrastructure financing is on top of political agendas in many fora in the world. In high-level meetings such as the G20, for example, this is coming every year over and over as a prominent topic for discussion. But this agenda, when you look at it, it's primarily led by the private sector to secure profits. So it's private-led, but at the same time, it really needs public finance to develop as planned. The public funds are actually necessary for infrastructure projects to see the light, but also to de-risk the participation of private actors. And here actually we see that there is a threat that public finance is actually captured by this agenda to the detriment of local communities and citizens. So at the moment, there is already a lot of public money going to feed this agenda. For example, in 2017, there was a joint report by development banks, the largest development banks at international level, and they claim to have mobilized $73 billion only in 2017 for long-term private and institutional investors to finance infrastructure. So here there is a key role for development banks. They see their role in financing some of the projects, de-risking the participation of private actors, and also in helping develop a pipeline of bankable projects for these private actors to invest. But here the risk is for public money to end up guaranteeing the profits of private investors from revenue streams associated with user fees paid by citizens, actually. It's a logic of accumulation by dispossession, aiming to guarantee a financial extraction of wealth from the local communities, ordinary citizens, and territories at the benefit of few domestic and global investors, which are seeking basically huge return on their investments. Also, and I think it will be also discussed later in this conference, but there is also a big threat around debt sustainability linked to these mega corridors and big infrastructure approach. Indeed, the billions and trillions of dollars planned to be spent in the coming decades for large infrastructure projects are likely to pose a dilemma to many governments. Will they accept further indebtedness or then be accused of failing to meet the needs of their population by not financing infrastructure projects? That's a hard question. And another side of the risk is that new financing schemes and related public-private partnerships, for example, are likely to generate a new wave of foreign and domestic debt. And if something goes wrong around these mega projects, ultimately it would be host governments and public institutions picking up the bill, not the private sector as such. What are some of the key challenges around these infrastructure mega corridors, like the Belt and Road Initiative? I will try to come back to some of these now. I mean, first of all, infrastructure corridors are not new. The difference with the current situation is that now the plans that are on the drawing board are on a scale that we've never seen, witnessed before. And this is why we refer to these mega corridors. No continent, actually, apart from Antarctica, are excluded from this trend of mega corridors. And at the end of the presentation, I just added a few maps showing you, all these mega corridors on different continents. So it's relevant for Africa, Asia, South America. So some of the continents actually targeted by the Belt and Road Initiative, but also for Europe, where you have these infrastructure master plans that have been drawn to reconfigure whole regions and the seas actually connecting them into a lot of new buzzwords those days, production and distribution hubs, development corridors, special economic zones, and interconnectors. Obviously, let's say the big daddy of these corridor plans is the Belt and Road Initiative. And that's also the most visible and perhaps the most advanced at international level. And it is largely criticized for its geopolitical implications, but much less for the concept underpinning it, which is also about physical and financial extraction, like for other mega corridors. Our analysis is that the gigantic scale of infrastructure proposed today will profoundly transform and redesign entire territories, regions, and economies, and then the life of billions of people. Because mega corridors are primarily aimed at enhancing export of raw materials and goods and integrating economies in global markets. These corridors will also streamline transportation routes globally and enhance access to a limited number of hubs where the demand can be centralized. In a nutshell, this agenda aims at speeding circulation in the production sphere globally and somehow revamp economic globalization. So it's no surprise that on the one hand, you have, for example, China pushing for these mega corridors and also portraying itself as the promoter of a new kind of globalization at international level. It's nothing contradictory, actually. Our critical take on that is that ultimately pushing for these mega corridors and this new type of globalization will scale up an already failing development model and its associated global division of labor, which could be locked in for decades to come. The moment there is an obsession about this infrastructure gap at the level of the G20, for example, or the World Bank, and the dominant narrative is that to fill this infrastructure gap, you need to scale up investments from billions to trillions. But in parallel, those institutions promoting this agenda are paying very little attention to the potential consequences of it. We already discussed some of the financial implications. But last year, actually, there was a very interesting report published by the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. It was called The Over Infrastructure Gap, Sustainability. And here, the report was pretty clear about the massive impacts of large-scale infrastructure projects on human rights in the countries where this is taking place. And of course, there is a big issue linked to sustainability also in the climate field. I mean, large dams, power grids, transport projects, energy extraction or generation projects have tended to come with significant environmental and social costs. And the top-down mega project emphasis that has prevailed for decades has usually proven to be ineffective in really serving the needs of people and of communities, or of society in general. Both affected communities around the world and many civil society groups monitoring infrastructure finance have repeatedly pointed out to some of these problems. And it's pretty clear at the moment that the mega corridors designed all over the world are based on high carbon transport, like airports, motorways, and energy infrastructure, including prominently fossil fuels. So on the one hand, you have this infrastructure agenda promoted by financial institutions, the G20. And on the other hand, you have commitments to the Paris Agreement, for example, on climate. But actually, this mega corridors plan completely clashes with the infrastructure agenda. And we feel that actually it's not aligned at all with the objectives of the Paris Agreement. So here there is really an area to be considered further. I will conclude by coming back to some of the challenges around infrastructure and how to reclaim somehow infrastructure for the people and for territories. It's true that the scale of this issue makes it really hard for civil society, for critical decision makers to really grasp this new agenda and find ways to challenge it. And there are real difficulties that are linked to the mere concept of infrastructure, like how to criticize an infrastructure-related agenda in countries where basic needs of the population, which could be served by well-tailored infrastructure and public services, are actually not really met. That's an important question. How to challenge the growing involvement of the private and financial sector when in many countries, unfortunately, the public sector has itself failed to deliver on basic infrastructure. I think these are challenges when you want to tackle this agenda and the risks posed by mega corridors. At the same time, the various impacts and dimensions of large-scale infrastructure projects, which range from transparency to corruption, tax evasion, debt, threat, poverty eradication, human rights, and environmental impacts, all of this will imply that actually a great diversity of local communities and social movements will inevitably face the challenges raised by this agenda in the coming years or coming decades. Because this infrastructure and investment agenda is not so much about bricks and mortars or about concrete projects, but it's primarily linked with systematic wealth extraction from communities and territories that are being reshaped in the name of capital accumulation. And this logic really ignores the fact that infrastructure that delivers the highest public goods is generally not the one that guarantees the highest return on investment. So in our view, what is at stake here is for citizens, communities, and social movements to reclaim infrastructure and essential services. And exposing actually the weaknesses of the current agenda is, in our view, an important step to advance a public critique of infrastructure. So what I try to do here is linking up your conversation with the broader picture at international level about the key drivers on infrastructure finance and mega corridor. And maybe I will just conclude with a message about the fact that actually the Belt and Road Initiative can be considered problematic, not only because of being driven by China and the geopolitical dimension around it. And actually I will leave it to other panelists to discuss more what are the specificities of that dimension. But it's also problematic because of the economic model that it promotes, which is actually not only the Belt and Road Initiative doing that, but many of the other mega corridors being planned and or built around the world. So these were the key messages I wanted to share. And I will just finish by showing you some of these maps of different continents where you see that, you know, mega corridors are becoming a reality. And actually, when you look into the different continents, a lot of the links are actually to extract, especially raw materials from the inside of the continents to export. So a lot of connections are with ports and coasts. I can share the presentation later on. And that is Europe. So it's of course relevant for other continents, but Europe is indeed, with the Belt and Road Initiative and other initiatives, pretty much targeted by this mega corridor approach. Thank you.